Welcome, everyone. I'm Heather Gatney, and I'm the coordinator of the CVFS webinar series. Our host today is Nick Shaquette-Levy, postdoctoral associate at Boston University. Nick is going to present preliminary findings from his climate risk perception survey. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation. We ask that you remain muted until then. During the Q&A, you may raise your hand to ask a question, or you can submit a question at any time today using the chat feature. We'd also like to inform you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to view from the CVFS website. We'll also have the slides up there later today. Okay, all yours, Nick.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Heather, for hosting these webinars, and thanks to all of you for making the time to attend today. This is really exciting to be able to speak with the CVFS group that I've learned so much from over the last couple of years about some of the data that we've collected a couple of years ago around climate-driven risks in subsistence farming communities. And I'll mention off the bat that this was the formal papers in collaboration with Dirga, with Michael Oppenheimer, who was my PhD advisor at Princeton, as well as Indra Chowdhury, Rajendra Gamiri, and Dil C.K. from ISERN. But of course, as you all know, there's a huge team of other folks at ISERN who provided a lot of invaluable support with data collection and getting me situated. So I'm very grateful to them as well. And I'll just mention, this is a manuscript that's currently under review in Population and Environment. So feedback on this paper is still very welcome, but also at the end, I'll try to end with a few thoughts or questions, maybe to hopefully see discussion around potentially other ways we could use this data in collaboration with all of you, or maybe other kinds of data that we have through CVFS. So with that, I'll get started. And just to set a little bit of kind of overall big picture motivation for why we were interested in doing this study. So we know that, climate impacts on the agricultural sector worldwide are likely to be to worsen and become more severe over the course of this century. This particular graphic is from the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from the report a year ago. And it shows for some of the major staple crops around the world, what is the projected impact of different degrees of temperature rise on average yields. And so what you see on the x-axis is different kind of potential temperature rises globally. On the y-axis, we see kind of those projected changes in yield compared to kind of a business as usual case where, or not a business, or counterfactual where we didn't have changes in climate. And then the different colored bars show for different parts of the world with different kind of baseline temperatures, what that might look like. So I think just a couple of key takeaways that I would distill from this. One is that there is a lot of uncertainty depending on parts of the world and specific crops. But the general trend line, as you can imagine, is that there's likely to be pretty severe declines in crop yields due to climate impacts. And with that kind of high uncertainty, with that potential risk comes the potential for maladaptation. So strategies that might work in the short term that might be ineffective or even counterproductive in the long term. And in particular, one of the things that we were interested in understanding is how farmers are thinking about these climate risks and how it might be affecting their livelihood decision-making. And so there's a whole body of literature that's been developed really in the past 15 to 20 years, looking at these kinds of questions around the world. And there's a few kind of stylized facts that we're able to kind of pull from the literature. So one is that farmers are actually pretty good about perceiving general long-term climate trends. For example, kind of changes in the onset of monsoon seasons, or maybe drying, climates or hotter temperatures during growing seasons. This is true across South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and other regions. When we ask farmers about this, we being kind of the academic community, we actually get pretty accurate responses from farmers. But maybe one of the puzzles is that this hasn't led to a lot of observed adaptation actions or changes in behavior that we would expect to see if farmers really did perceive these risks. And in fact, from a policy standpoint, a lot of governments and NGOs have dedicated some time and money to improving climate information services, the types of kind of information that can be provided to farmers on a seasonal or even sub-seasonal basis. And those seem to have had limited success, again, in kind of shifting behavior as we would expect because of climate risks. And there's this graphic from a nice review by Kieran Finlater and co-authors from a couple of years ago that I think really kind of lays this out nicely, that at least in the climate science community, there's been a lot of time and effort spent on improving kind of the data and the information that we're able to draw and give to farmers. So things like subseasonal forecasts, having kind of better geographical resolution on what climate impacts are likely going to hit and when. But there hasn't necessarily been the same advancements in terms of understanding how farmers or other end users actually use the decision or use the information in their decision making. And so there's a potential gap between our kind of technical abilities to project climate impacts, but then our kind of social science understanding of what to do with that. And that's kind of part of the gap that motivates this particular study. And so one of the things we wanted to look at is there's several different theories, right, about how people make decisions under uncertainty that we thought would be useful to kind of test the implications of through this kind of survey. And so I'll go through a couple of those theories here. One that probably many of you are likely very familiar with is the new economics of labor migration that was developed in the 1980s and has been refined since then. And the basic idea of this theory is it focuses on kind of rural households in developing country contexts. And it postulates that rural households generally face a lot of volatility to their income and to their crops and subsistence. And also these households tend not to have good access to formal financial services. And so the way that households kind of manage that volatility is by allocating different members of their household to different types of livelihoods, including migration, as a way to balance out different income sources and hopefully smooth out risks across any one geography or livelihood. Another potentially useful theory is called protection motivation theory. And this was actually developed in the health sciences literature, but I think has been applied kind of more broadly since then. And the basic focus of this theory is that it's seeking to understand how what motivates us to take actions in response to perceived threats. And I think kind of the key insight from this theory is that the likelihood of taking an action against a threat is related to both kind of how severe and salient that threat is to you, but also how likely or what likelihood you think you have to do something that tangibly can affect to that risk. And so you might perceive a severe threat, but if you don't necessarily think you have the agency to do anything about it, you might adopt kind of this more fatalistic outlook and just accept what's coming. And so that might be kind of one relevant theory for why we haven't seen this kind of adaptation shift. And then finally, another theory is called security, potential, and aspiration. And this comes more from the psychology and kind of investment literature. It's closely related to cumulative prospect theory by the late Daniel Kahneman and Tversky. The basic idea in security, potential, aspiration is that most decision makers, when they're evaluating kind of a portfolio of different options, they want to meet a basic aspiration level. So think about like maybe an income or maybe for farmers, a certain harvest. And we're actually risk seeking in terms of trying to meet that aspiration level. So if we are not sure if we're going to meet that basic harvest, we might actually gamble to make sure we try to meet that basic kind of level that we have in our minds. But once we've kind of are relatively assured that we have the basic subsistence or income that we want, then we become more risk averse in terms of future gambles in maximizing income. And so that also might be useful in this context. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the evidence we found across these different theories. And so now to kind of shift specifically to our study, so the main kind of research questions that animated our data collection were, we wanted to better understand how heterogeneity in information sources are correlated with farmers' perceptions of climate risks. We wanted to get a sense of how salient is climate to not just farming, but also a whole bunch of other livelihoods that farmers could adopt. And does climate risks enter into their decision-making about whether to take on those livelihoods? And then finally, how does experience with climate risks and climate hazards, how does that influence how farmers derive their income and their income diversification strategies? And I'll just start off with a few key takeaways and then go into kind of the data collection and the analysis. But just as a kind of a summary of what we found on the information sources question, one of the interesting takeaways is that kind of access to more official information sources. So this would be like agricultural extension officers, other government sources, veterinarians, people with kind of professionalized expertise. The farmers who reported consulting these sources actually generally have a lower perceived risk of climate change, which was a little bit counterintuitive to my initial hypothesis. And we can get into maybe some reasons for why that might be the case. In terms of salience of climate risk to livelihoods, we found that perceptions of climate risks actually appears even more salient to some alternatives to farming than to farming itself. So for things like migration, how you perceive climate risks actually ends up being pretty salient to your overall perception of migration, perhaps even more so than your perception of farming, which again might be one kind of explanation for why we haven't seen the shift in behavior due to climate risks. And then finally, on income strategies, we find that exposure to climate-driven hazards, and in particular droughts and floods, is associated with an increased reliance on farming for your household income, which again might run a little bit counter to our expectations from new economics of labor migration. And I'll get into more detail on each of these. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about some other data that we collected that didn't necessarily make it into this paper, but I think there might be, interesting opportunities to combine some of the rich kind of social data from this survey and perhaps many other CVFS surveys with kind of remotely sensed climate indicators that, geoscientists and other climate scientists have been working on. So kind of with that layout, I'll talk a little bit about the survey that we did in 2022. And so again, our target was to look at how farmers in the Chitwan Valley are thinking about climate risks and how this enters into their decision making. And so before doing a survey, we did a set of qualitative interviews and pre-testing of questions. And just a couple of themes that came out of this that I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with in terms of the context. But some of the salient themes for us were that farmers generally have pretty small plot sizes, usually 1 to 2 hectares, if that, which doesn't give them a lot of resources to be able to try out a lot of different strategies, right, to mitigate climate risks. But at the same time, at least this being my first time in Chitwan Valley, I was really surprised by the diversity of livelihoods that farmers are able to manage even on small plot sizes. And so most farmers, were telling us that they would have 2 to 3 cropping seasons, right, and grow maybe 4 to 6 crops throughout the year. As well, they would often have some sort of livestock, whether that's cows or maybe goats or roosters or chickens. Most farmers that we talked to had at least one household member that was living either in Kathmandu or often abroad and sending remittances back to the household. So that was kind of a key way to diversify income. And then the vast majority of farmers that we talked to reported being exposed to several different types of climate risks, including droughts, floods, pests, et cetera. And so all these were kind of very relevant themes for the questions that we were asking about and helped to inform kind of the survey instrument that we used. And so to get a little bit more into that, we essentially conducted a survey of face-to-face surveys lasting about an hour with 500 households in the Chitwan district. These were the particular wards that we sampled from. So I think this is ward 23 and 26, or maybe it's the opposite way around. But the basic idea is we wanted to survey households or sample households that were close to each of the 2 main rivers in the region, the Narayani River and East Rapti River, as we thought they might have different propensities to flood and different kind of severity of flooding. And we also sampled households more inland that maybe weren't quite as exposed to floods, but maybe have to deal with droughts or hail or some other types of hazards as well. And I'm sure as many of you are quite familiar with the region, we also kind of focused on kind of the middle part of the district, going from west to east, which is kind of a mid-development stage, right? So from what I understand, households closer to the western side tend to be kind of have lower socioeconomic status, and households closer to the eastern side and closer to Bhawartpur tend to have kind of more development. And so we were kind of in the mid-development part of this district. And so what did we ask about? We collected calendar data from 2015 to 2021 on households' livelihood choices, on their incomes, as well as their exposure to climate hazards. And I'll go into more detail on that in the next slide. We also had a cross-sectional kind of questionnaire. We had more kind of just cross-sectional data on the types of information that households were consulting in making their economic decisions, the types of social groups and social networks that they belong to, and then different indices of their perceptions of livelihood risks and of climate risks, which again, I'll get into more in the next couple slides. Just to give a sense of the demographics of the survey sample. So here I'm showing a table of kind of our survey, summary statistics of our survey sample compared to the 2021 census for Chitwan as a whole, and then Nepal as a whole. And so a couple of key differences arise. Our sample was much more female. The respondents we had much higher proportion of female respondents compared to the general population. Our sample also tended to be older. So we had about half of our respondents between the ages of 35 and 55, which is significantly older than the general population. Also tend to have less formal education. So about half of our respondents had 5 years or less of formal educational attainment, which is again, more than the general population. And then this one is a bit more complicated, but in terms of caste identity, we had more respondents from kind of castes that would typically be or historically be lower socioeconomic status. So in particular, we had a high proportion of Tharu, Dharai, and Kumal indigenous respondents. We also had a fairly high proportion of Dalit respondents, but also a pretty high proportion of Brahmin Kshatriya as well. So we kind of had different spectrums in terms of castes. But the key point is that although this isn't necessarily representative of the entire Nepali population, it is, we argue, kind of more representative of what we would expect in rural subsistence communities and in particular, kind of focusing specifically on those who generally have farming as a main livelihood, which was kind of our selection criteria is respondents that farm. And so hopefully some of the insights that we have are maybe generalizable to other kind of farming communities in the region. So I mentioned some of the data we collected was through the calendar approach that some of you pioneered and many of you have used. So I'm sure you're quite familiar with this, but just to summarize kind of the key advantages of this approach. So in a perfect world, we would love to go kind of every year, right, and sample the same subjects year after year to see how their livelihood choices change and how their exposure to climate hazards change. But because of time and money and all that, that's difficult. So another way of doing this is presenting kind of a physical calendar that interviewers would give respondents. And so here we have kind of Western calendar years as columns, as well as the Nepali calendar year that most aligns with that year. And then as well as kind of local cues, so things like the earthquake in 2015, or more recently, the onset of COVID in 2020. And so that's been shown through many of your studies and other CVFS studies to really improve respondent recall in terms of sequencing of different events. And so we're able to use this to get a sense of what livelihoods that people pursued and the production they got from different farming livelihoods. Here I'm just showing an example of cropping decisions, but we also had livestock decisions, migration decisions, whether they had small businesses, things like that. And then the new thing that we did for this survey was also extend this to include encounters with climate risks. And so we would ask people, did you experience a drought that affected your crop plantation and harvest in each of these years? Did you experience a flood or excess heat or hail? And these were all hazards that came out of our qualitative interviews that people reported, having had some experience with in the past few years. And so that ideally gives us a nice kind of temporal variation, like within subject, to see how, maybe exposure to different hazards over time might be correlated with different livelihood choices, as well as kind of between subjects comparison. And so getting into some of the results, one of the first things that we wanted to get a sense of is how salient is climate relative to a whole bunch of other risk factors that might enter into farmers' decision-making. And so even before asking specific questions about climate, we ask farmers generally, how important are different types of factors in your economic success, ranging from access to labor, having good health, access to finance, et cetera. And we ask respondents to rate that from a low, medium, high kind of Likert scale. And then one thing that we noticed, we wanted to ask about climate change, but in our pre-survey kind of tests and interviews, we noticed that there was a wide variety of how respondents might interpret the words climate change, right? Some people had a very, scientific understanding, others kind of less so. And so to have something that was a bit more standardized across the respondents, we essentially proxied climate change by asking about long-term weather. And we defined that in our questionnaire by kind of weather events that lasted 2 weeks or more, which isn't quite the same thing as climate change, but hopefully is a good proxy for, hazards that are linked to climate change. And so when we asked about that in relation to all the other factors, what we found is that more survey respondents indicated that long-term weather factors were highly salient to their success, more so than any other factor that we asked about. So suggesting that climate probably is something that is highly salient to a lot of farmers. And then we drilled specifically into among different types of hazards that are linked to climate change, like droughts, floods, availability of groundwater, et cetera. For each respondent, how do you see these changing over the next 5 years? Do you see these increasing in risk in terms of its impact on your crops? Do you see them decreasing in risk? Or do you see kind of no substantial change? And so we saw some variation across different types of hazards, but in general, we saw that for a lot of risks, a majority or plurality of respondents indicated that they thought these risks were going to worsen in impact over the next 5 years, especially for things like hail or pests, droughts, and floods. Interestingly, less so for hail, and we could get into Q&A about why maybe certain hazards are perceived as kind of more risky or changing in risk than others. But these are kind of summary statistics across our sample. And what we wanted to do is create an index for each individual respondent about how severely they view climate risks. And so the way we did this was to get a sense of how salient this was for each respondent. So we measured the response to kind of long-term weather relative to how they rated other factors as an indicator of their salience. And we multiplied that by an index we created about, how many hazards did farmers believe were going to get worse in impact over the next 5 years. And so that gives us an idea of how salient climate is to farmers and also which direction they believe that climate risks are going. And so when we do that, we get a climate risk perception score. And so that helps us address our first question, which is, how does your information source relate to your perception of climate risk? And so here I'm showing a couple different information sources we asked about, and we can map this along a few kind of interesting dimensions. And so the size of the bubble represents, out of our survey sample, what proportion of people reported consulting this source at least once in the past year. So for example, more people reported consulting social media than consulting an agricultural extension officer. Then on the x-axis, we ask, for those of you who have consulted this source, how frequently on average would you consult this? From less than monthly on the left to more than monthly on the right-hand side of the axis. And then the y-axis is, how much do you trust this source, from low trust being 1 to high trust being 3. And then finally, the color of the bubble represents, for everybody consulting this source, what was their average, risk perception score for climate risks on our index. And so here we can see, for example, that people consult social media more often than agricultural extension officers, but on average maybe have a bit less trust in social media and tend to have maybe a bit higher perception of risk for those who consult social media versus those who consult agricultural extension. And of course, there is some overlap, right? Some people might be consulting both of these. But then we can map out a whole bunch of other information sources, which we have on this graph. And we can get into specific sources, but I think there's a couple general trends that are interesting. So one is that there's a cluster of what I would call kind of informal media. So people who consult social media, or friends locally within Chitwan, friends living outside of Chitwan, or radio and television. And these sources are generally consulted by a majority of our survey sample. They tend to be consulted pretty frequently. And the people who consult these sources tend to have kind of above average perceptions of climate risk, where kind of orange and yellow tend to indicate a higher perceived climate risk. On the other hand, we have another cluster of what I would call more official or professional sources. So these would be like agricultural extension officers, veterinarian, other government sources, religious leaders, and scientists that tend to be consulted by a fewer proportion of the population, or consulted less frequently, but are highly trusted for the most part. And with the exception of scientists, the people who consult these sources tend to have pretty low perceptions of climate risks, which again was a bit counter to my initial expectations. I would have thought that people who have access to government sources would have more information about climate change and maybe be thinking about this more often. And so we didn't go into this survey specifically the reasons why people consulting sources, like what kind of information they were getting from those sources. But one hypothesis could be that people that consult government sources maybe are getting information about kind of at least near-term strategies to deal with climate hazards. So for example, maybe extension officers are telling them about drought-resistant seeds, or veterinarians are helping to provide care for animals that might be experiencing heat stress. And so that can actually lead to kind of a sense of security that other people might not have. But I think an open question is, like, over time, as we expect these climate risks to really increase in severity, like, are those solutions that are being provided by these government or professional sources enough to really cover that? And could this potentially lead to a false sense of security? But that's just one hypothesis, and maybe something that would be worth digging more into in future data collection. So the second question we had was, how relevant is climate risk perceptions to your overall perception of different types of livelihoods that you could pursue? And so here we asked people to rank different livelihoods, including farming, livestock, migration, et cetera, along this question of, how risky do you think this livelihood is when it comes to earning a living? And again, having this kind of simple Likert scale of not risky, somewhat risky, or highly risky. And of course, respondents always had the option to say, I don't know. And then we can estimate through an ordered logit model what factors might be influencing your likelihood of going up the risk ranking in terms of rating a particular livelihood as risky. And so here we're estimating the dependent variable, which is the probability of moving up one category in the risk ranking scale. And we do that as a function of demographic variables, so people's gender, their age group, their education attainment. We ask about social capital variables, so how many information sources they're consulting, how many social groups are they a part of. And then, at least for this question, the key focal variable is how is your climate risk perception related to your likelihood of rating different livelihoods as risky? And so I'll show the results for this, but I'm happy to show kind of the broader table with other factors if people are interested. But just honing in on the effect of your perception of climate risk, what we find is that if we look at just farming, maybe as expected, people who have a higher perceived climate risk are also more likely to perceive farming as risky compared to people who have lower perceived climate risks. So that matches our intuition. What's interesting is if we compare that now to other types of livelihoods that people might diversify to, things like livestock, engaging in off-farm employment as wage labor, or migrating internationally, we actually see that the effect of having a high perception of climate risk is actually just as salient, if not more impactful, in terms of your likelihood of rating that particular livelihood as risky. And so that might be suggesting that, again, one reason why maybe farmers are accurately perceiving climate risks, but not necessarily showing a lot of livelihood diversification, is because some of these other options are also being seen as risky because of climate change, which again, we can go into maybe some hypotheses about why that might be, but I think that's an interesting thing to maybe draw out. And just as a check, we also asked about receiving pension income, kind of as something that we would not expect, right, to be impacted by climate risk necessarily. And indeed, we don't see a significant impact of your perception of climate risk on your pension income. So that gives us a little bit of confidence that it's not just an artifact of how we're asking the question, but hopefully there's something, or there's likely something real kind of driving these increased risks of perceived risk of livelihoods as a function of climate change. And then kind of the last question that I wanted to show some results on is what's driving kind of changes in income composition over time. And so this graph on the left-hand side shows averaged across our sample population or survey population, or survey sample, I should say, how are households earning their income on each of the years that we asked about. And so blue represents farming. So you can imagine in a subsistence community, most of the farming that's done is for your own consumption and maybe not so much for selling to commercial markets. Orange is the proportion of incomes coming from livestock. So things like either meat sales or milk sales. Green is the proportion coming from income earned from off-farm labor, but locally within Chitwan. Red is remittances from migrants, from the household sending remittances back to the household. And then purple is other sources. So things like if you have a own business or if you're receiving pension income. And so I think that shows on average a very diversified portfolio, which again, we would expect from like the new economics of labor migration. But within households, we see a lot of variation. So we saw some households that were almost exclusively reliant on farming and livestock for the income, and other households that were almost exclusively reliant on migration remittances and really didn't earn income in any other way. And so that gives us both kind of within subject and again, between subject variation that we can exploit. And so here we use an ordinary least squares model. And what we're predicting as the dependent variable is the proportion of household I's income that's coming from a particular livelihood K in a given year T. And so we can predict that as a function of different demographic characteristics of the household, of the respondent's perception of livelihood risk, and then of their self-reported exposure to different hazards. And so here again, we picked floods and droughts as two hazards that a good proportion of households experience without it being kind of ubiquitous. So that gives us some variation. And then we have time-fixed effects to control for kind of population-wide trends. And for example, if there's more industrialization going on in Chitwan over time, we can control for that. And then an error term that accounts for other unobservable factors that might influence our dependent variable. And so here I'll just show kind of visually the effects of these different variables. So here, each of these kind of rows represents one of those independent variables in our equation. The color of the bar represents the direction of that variable has on, here is the reliance on farming for income. So variables that have a kind of a brown bar indicate that actually reduces a household's, is associated with less kind of reliance on farming income for your household income composition. And variables with kind of a green bar indicate that those variables are contributing to kind of higher reliance on farming for your income. And then the significant variables are shown by the asterisks, like using this significance level here. And so a couple of key things to draw out, we found that households rely more on farming for their income if they perceive it as risky, if they participate in more local social groups, and if they experience floods and or droughts in any given year, which some of those, again, run counter maybe to our expectations. And especially, well, maybe before doing that, just as one check, we were also curious whether this is kind of a contemporaneous thing or if there's a lagged effect. So we also asked, we kind of lagged responses by saying, how does like a drought or a flood in year 0, how does that impact your reliance on farming 1 year after you're experiencing a drought or flood, or 2 years after experiencing a drought or flood? And here we found kind of evidence that this increased reliance on farming is pretty persistent, even 2 years after experiencing a hazard. And so that raises the question, do people who experience a natural hazard, do they rely more on farming potentially because of financial constraints, because having a drought or a flood reduces the income that you could use to deploy to afford things like migration, or maybe searching for off-farm jobs or livestock? Or is it maybe something psychological where like thinking back to that security potential aspiration theory, maybe people have, a set harvest that they want to meet. And if they feel that that's under threat, then they'll reinvest resources they have to meet that basic harvest. And so we don't know for sure, like in our survey design, we didn't have a good way of teasing this out, except that we can disaggregate results by different income quartiles. And at least at first blush, we would expect that if financial constraints were really the driver of this effect, then we would expect poorer households to show more of a reliance on farming when they are hit with a hazard, because they're the ones who are likely least able to have resources to reallocate. Whereas if it's a psychological mechanism, then maybe we would expect to see that more in wealthier households, because they might still have resources to reallocate to farming if that was kind of what they really wanted to double down on. And so it's kind of, long story short, we actually see evidence for both. So for a drought, which is a longer, generally a slower onset event, we see that it's really just the wealthier households that are increasing their reliance on farm income. So that might be evidence of kind of that psychological effect, where households are reallocating resources over time to really meet, what they see as their basic kind of role or aspiration. But for floods, for fast onset events, we actually see both ends of the spectrum. So both the richest and the poorest households increasing their reliance on farm income. So again, that might show some evidence for both the financial mechanism and the psychological mechanism. And so then just to summarize some key findings from this paper, I guess some of the key messages would be that we found that differentiated access to information leads to heterogeneity in risk perceptions, and in particular, kind of those official or professional sources kind of lead to lower perceptions of climate risks. We found that climate contributes to increased perceived risk, not just of farming, but also of other types of livelihoods that we would typically think of as income diversification strategies. And we found evidence that households might double down on farming when they're experiencing extreme events, perhaps both through financial and psychological mechanisms. And so maybe from a policy perspective, some takeaways from that climate information standpoint is that, current climate information services might be unintentionally lowering perceived climate risks, perhaps by giving kind of effective solutions that are effective in the short term. But again, maybe not encouraging broader systemic shifts that might need to happen if we really see kind of 2, 3, or 4 degrees Celsius of warming. And we also, and maybe another kind of recommendation would be that in addition to giving, better information on seasonal forecasts, perhaps pairing that with information on livelihood alternatives and maybe things that help reduce the risk of those livelihood alternatives could be a more increasingly effective way to promote livelihood diversification, if that's something that policymakers are looking to do, which, again, there are trade-offs there as well. The last thing I wanted to say is, so this was kind of what fit into the paper, but we did collect a lot of data that we didn't fit into the paper that might be of interest for other folks within the CVFS community. So just to give a quick outline of what that looked like, we have livelihood calendar data on farmers' land use and tenure. So which farmers, how much they rented land, how much they rented out their own land to other farmers. We asked about kind of in every given year, how many household members were migrating both within Nepal and also internationally. So it might be interesting to look at, different destinations, as well as farmers' water use, like to what extent do they have access to irrigation versus using groundwater, which I think is increasingly becoming an important policy question in a lot of South Asian contexts. In terms of the Likert scale questions, we also asked farmers about their basic life aspirations. So like, to what extent was it important to them to have their children continue farming versus having their children get a good education versus kind of more material indicators of a good life, like having appliances or a car or something like that. We asked farmers about specific actions they took in response to hazards. So kind of more intentional, maybe adaptation strategies that farmers themselves are consciously deploying that I can show some information on in the Q&A. We also asked about other factors that affect farmers or respondents' migration decisions. So kind of what factors made them more or less likely to consider migration. And then the last thing we did, which didn't quite work out as well, but might still have some useful data, is we also added a vignette experiment, because one of the things that we were interested in is how different types of policies might impact how people view the risks of different livelihoods. And so in particular, we wanted to get a sense of, does a general cash transfer policy, would that kind of change people's decision-making around which livelihoods they would be likely to pursue versus having access to, subsidized crop insurance? And so we asked people, we gave them that kind of this hypothetical policy scenario, and then we asked them to rate how they think that would change their perceived riskiness of different strategies and what kind of livelihoods they would pursue. I started analyzing the data, and at least in terms of what kind of livelihoods people would pursue, it didn't seem like either policy really had an appreciable impact on livelihood decisions. And that might just be because like these are still quite hypothetical, right? And without having an actual policy in place or without having a lot of people that were familiar with these policies, there just not might be a lot of time or to think about like what the implication of those policies might be. But there still might be some interesting data in terms of how this impacts people's risk perceptions. And then going forward, in terms of next steps, thinking about maybe future data collection, I would really love to think about how to develop better kind of hazard indicators that are more informed by kind of rich social science information. And it was actually a really nice review a year or two ago by people, climate scientists who are really improving kind of our drought monitor data, but making the point that we don't have good information about what people actually do with that drought monitor data and what are the downstream consequences of droughts. And so I think there's some really interesting questions that maybe we could answer with future data collection or maybe even with existing CVFS data around how well do different drought indicators, so things that might be collected at weather stations or even remotely sensed by satellites, how do those actually reflect on the ground experiences that farmers report with whether or not they experienced a drought and how that made them change their behavior, as well as how to maybe connect early warning drought indicators, not just to say like we think there's a good chance that this year there will be a drought, but thinking about what might be the downstream impacts of that drought. So what does that mean for what we know about people's risk perceptions, maybe what income or livelihood strategies they're likely or less likely to pursue if a drought does materialize, and what that might mean for migration decisions. And then finally, I think a really interesting question, at least in the climate literature, is around the idea of compound hazards. So multiple hazards that occur at the same time or very close in time. And I think with the calendar data that we have, one of the things that I think would be a nice like next step would be to see how households that experience multiple hazards at the same time or in quick succession, do they exhibit different types of risk perceptions and behaviors than households who maybe haven't had that compound hazard exposure. So with that, I'll just say thank you, Dhanyabad, to Dirga first and foremost, but also to a great team of researchers at ISERN who were just a lot of joy to work with and were very giving of their time and expertise in helping to think about the survey and doing the data collection. I had a blast when I was there, and I'd love to hopefully come back sometime soon. So I'll stop there and would welcome questions or comments or suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Sorry for my technical difficulties. My first question is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
And I apologize for missing some of your presentation, and I'm sure that's affected my ability to engage in the discussion. Nicholas, I'm overwhelmed by how much you have going on here. And it's interesting, in my having missed a piece of the lead up, maybe that's like me specific. But in each one of the cool sets of results I saw you present, I think I had more questions. Like each one of them. Like pick one, I tell you, I saw the life history calendar and I worried about having it annualized. We know Nepali years and English years don't match. And so, how far off are people? And, I started putting that with things like drought events. I got the idea of farming. Nicholas, I was in Chitwan for the first time in a long time in December, and I was blown away by how diverse the farming choices have become. Why are people growing dragon fruit? I don't get it.
Yeah.
So, farming just seemed like too big a category for me. Like I can't cope with it. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
People are choosing dragon fruit versus papaya versus rice versus, I don't know. And how frequently does that change? I don't know. And like risky jobs caught my attention for sure. I don't know about everybody else on this call, let alone all the people who might look at the video, but I think COVID affected my thinking about what's risky and what's not. I wondered, are there some jobs that you didn't show us that really are super risky? I don't know what to pick there, folks. I was thinking politics, like I'm going to be prime minister. Is that risky? I don't know. What's a job that would be risky no matter? And can we show that same like independence from the climate events? But yeah, I just kind of got overwhelmed by all the potential. Let me put it a little bit more. Yeah, this one, I'm like, okay, so we see the line. And I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, climate could affect all four of those. Are there some other ones that it couldn't? Well, pension seems unrisky. Like if I didn't hear the question and all I heard was the word risky, I still rate pension over here, right? I'm like,
Yeah.
why? No, I don't know. And actually these models too, sorry. Thank you for showing the model. I love a multivariate model. Nobody will say otherwise, but it scares me always to see multiple variables in the model without seeing them one at a time first, because I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, did this one change when you did that? Did that one change when you did the other? Sorry, too many questions. Nicholas, pick what you're interested in talking about.
No, that's great. I appreciate all those comments. I took lots of notes already. Maybe a couple of things at the beginning. So just a clarification, a couple clarifications. So yeah, on the survey calendar, the calendar actually was delivered in Nepali years, and then we kind of back calculated what the Western year would be.
Yeah,
But
pretty
yeah,
normal for us.
obviously,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, the question about like going there and seeing like a whole bunch of different crops like dragon fruit, I think is super interesting. And I should have clarified, because I had presented this to a more general audience that wasn't quite familiar with the context. But when I said farming here, I should clarify that here specifically we asked, like we did separate out different types of crops in terms of livelihood calendar, in terms of asking about risk, which was separate than the livelihood calendar, right? The risk was just like a series of questionnaires. There we did distinguish between cereal crops versus like subsistence crops versus cash crops. So here I'm showing kind of subsistence crops. When I say farming, I mean kind of the subsistence crops farming, and how risky do they think climate, how risky
All
do they
right,
view that?
let me probe those two words just a minute more, Nicholas. So subsistence versus cash, you differentiated. I hear you. And Professor Gamiri, Professor Sharma, feel free to call me out of date on this one. But when I moved to Chitwan, the difference between subsistence and cash was how many different times a year you could grow rice. And so, one time a year you got to grow rice for subsistence. You get to grow it twice, all of a sudden you're into cash. And so I don't know, my friend. Like, could it be like, are we differentiating whether you're getting paid money for it when you call it a cash crop, or are you differentiating type of crop? You used the word cereal for a second, which made me think type of crop.
Yeah, it's a good distinction. So from what I remember in the livelihood calendar, we ask about type of crops. So we say specifically rice, maize, wheat, and then fruits and vegetables. I'll have to double check. It's a good differentiation. In the risk, I don't know if Derek, if you remember, but in the risk question, I don't know if we asked about subsistence versus cash, or if we asked about like rice, maize, and wheat versus fruits and vegetables as the two.
Jirga, while you think about that, I gotta throw in chickens there, because I was really stunned about that too, Nicholas. When I'd been there 5 years early, chicken farms all over the place, big deal. I get there now, walking around, there's all these abandoned chicken farms. Like the physical structure still there. Nobody bought it and refilled it with their chickens. It's just gone. No chickens, just the empty building standing there. And I'm like, wow, what happened to poultry?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have two comments. One is your observation could be time sensitive. Maybe that is the time that they sold the chicken and are waiting for the next batch.
And that would be true across multiple farms, Jirga? That would be true like through Chitwan and something like that?
Because some of them are really seasonal, and driven by the demand. Like
I mean, carrots, I knew carrots were that way. I didn't know chickens were that way. Seasonal, I mean.
Yeah. And driven by demand. Like if there is a big lot of chicken coming from India, yes, farmers in Chitwan will not be interested to raise.
Just stop.
Yeah.
Even if they have the buildings and everything. Interesting.
About subsistence versus commercial, I think we have a question about, do you grow this for sale or for home consumption, something like that. Right. It may not be for every crop, but I think we somehow ask that in some of the questions there.
I mean, it's got to be relevant in all of them, I suppose, right? They're like dragon fruit, ISCRN is growing for consumption. Not because their livelihood depends on it, but because they like to eat them.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So you could have, I don't know, Nicholas, you could have like one papaya tree for consumption, or you
Yeah.
could have like a farm for,
Yep.
like it's a scale issue as well as
Yep.
what kind of crop is it issue.
Right.
Yeah. That's it. That's a good distinction. I appreciate you making that. And yeah, thanks, Durga, for clarifying. So yeah, you're right. I think for the risk we did, the distinction we made was between consumption versus selling. But it'd be interesting, like if we so I'm hoping to write a grant proposal, my first grant proposal, to do some more data collection along these lines. I think one thing that would be interesting is like for things like dragon fruit, especially like perennials, right? That like it's a higher upfront like cost, but then like you get fruit like year after year. And also like in terms of how water hungry like some of these crops are.
Oh yeah,
I think
yeah,
that would be
exactly what I
interesting
was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which historically, Durga, Utam, feel free, but I think historically how water hungry a crop is, I associated with both the rainfall, like the drought issue, but also like physically what kind of land you plant them on, because there's so many like
Yep.
higher, drier land, and it's only a 5-10 foot difference really in Chitwan. It's not like your mountainside, right? But it's like higher, drier land versus lower, wetter land. And should I plant here or there? Do I own this or that? I don't know. And I guess, Durga, I don't understand how drought affects the irrigation system. So, Nicholas, there's these canals that run through that the individual might not have a ton of control over, but does that mean if there's a drought, like Dirga, the whole Barapur municipality shuts it down and there's no water flowing for that season because of drought? I don't know how that works.
It is more of a decision of the bureaucrat or the people who operates that pump than what's the need of the farmer.
It's an interesting different view of risk, Nicholas. Like, drought sucks, but so does it suck when the politicians decide to turn the pumps off.
Yeah.
I'm also out of luck.
Yep.
No, I think that was like, I mean, that's a funny, but also like potentially very relevant example, right? But I think like that was part of the overall thrust of the motivation for this work is like, I think and I'm coming at this more from like the climate. I'm not a climate scientist, but my PhD advisor is one. So from that literature, there's a lot of impact or a lot of research on how does climate hazards impact your risk perception. But I think for me, one of the motivating factors of the study is like, there's a whole bunch of other risk factors that people deal with, right? The same person that's getting hit with climate risk is also getting hit with economic risk, political risk, health risks. And so how salient are these climate risks and how do they perhaps like intersect with these other forms of risks? So I think, yeah, that's a really, the example you brought is really relevant. Yeah.
No, and when you say you're considering proposals, I would say that COVID pre and post to throw that into the mix. Like, did that change people's risk perceptions? You have pre and post on some stuff. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, well, unfortunately for many, I mean, not the biggest impact of COVID, but like, yeah, we initially had planned this study in 2020, and so it got delayed by a couple of years, right? So by the time we asked people about risk perceptions, COVID had already happened. So I would say like
it's
baked in. It's baked in. We did ask a question, which I think in the pretest, I don't know if we actually included it in the final survey instrument about like trying to distinguish like what did you think about this pre-COVID versus post-COVID, but I think it was hard. Like we didn't get a lot of meaningful answers in terms of like to try to think back about how risky we saw something retrospectively, and that's kind of one of the methodological issues with doing risk perceptions, right? Is it's harder to do that retrospectively.
100%. And this is the same thing that worried me about the word risky. We're going to run out of time, so I don't want to go down the rabbit hole. But Durga, I made me want to talk about it in Nepalese and hear the Nepalese version of risky and what all might fall under the view of risky. But it's tricky, like you say, because their personal situation could make not farming risky, because if you're paid labor and you could be fired at the whim of whoever hired you, maybe that feels more risky than having some land and farming your own stuff. It's an interesting problem.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and just quickly, one other thing that I haven't done yet, but I keep getting the feedback on, and so I think this would be something pretty easy to do with our existing data. It's also separated this out by landholders versus like tenant farmers, which is like a whole different set of risks. And yeah, I think that's kind of one of the key next steps for this analysis.
Totally possible that you get just completely different pattern associations in those two groups. I mean, it's a great example.
Yeah, I was going to ask Nick, this was fabulous. Thank you so much. And I appreciate you had a lot of very cool graphics. So you may have even done this, and I just am not as advanced on presenting such nice graphics. But did you look at effect modification by any other socio-demographic characteristics? So landholding, I think, was one that definitely jumped out to me as well. I think that makes a lot of sense. But I'm curious if there are any. You have a small sample size, but
yeah, and no, I'm glad you asked that, because I didn't show it, but I do. So okay, so for the household income, are you asking about kind of the effects of different variables and like demographic variables and
yeah,
stuff?
yeah, because I know you controlled for them, but I'm curious if you
Yeah.
basically looked at stratification or effect modification.
So could you explain to me what do you mean by like effect modification?
If basically getting into the same thing that you just mentioned for landholders versus tenants. So
Okay, gotcha.
do the results differ by those groups? I don't know, you might have looked by social group or where in Chitwan that, distance to the rivers.
Yes. Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah. So I did it for we've done it for 2 dimensions so far. One is by the quartiles, like income quartiles. Another is by geographic. So I have like different, I don't have it with me, but basically separated out like, yeah, what if you were like in a subward that was by the river versus upland? And actually, I don't think there was like I'll have to look back through the data. It's a good question. I don't think there was a lot of differences in relationships there. The gender, so we do have like a couple, we did disaggregate. So I showed results for like your overall proportion of, or like your overall perception of climate risks, right? We had this kind of aggregate indicator, but we also analyzed the data more specifically for specific climate hazards. And there we did see some differences by things like gender and age. And so this isn't not necessarily disaggregation, like you said, but just like showing, sorry, let me just go to the right slide and spare you all the, we did see some interesting kind of effects of different demographic groups by, yeah, let me show this slide. Yeah. So in terms of,
yeah, I thought you did it, a lot of analysis in your supplementary material for the paper. No?
Yeah, which I'm happy to share, by the way, both
Yeah.
main text and SI.
Yeah, there are like 10 pages or more, like.
Yeah, I think like 20, but a lot of those are like maps and stuff. But yeah, so like a couple of things that were like, especially around gender, I have to tell this story, like when we first did the survey instrument. So I had read a lot of stuff around like California and how people were dealing with climate risks and like how groundwater was an issue. And then when we did like the initial survey instrument, I wanted to include groundwater. And I think some of the ISCRN staff was like, no, that's not a problem because like the monsoons just like recharge the groundwater aquifers. But I was like, well, it doesn't cost us anything to like really include one more question. And it turned out this is like the one climate hazard where there was a significant like gender difference in terms of perceived risk. So female respondents reported like a much higher perception of lack of groundwater being a risk than male respondents.
Disproportionately being asked to haul the bucket out of the well. 12 feet versus 10 starts to make a difference when you're pulling the bucket out of the well, it turns out.
Right. So I thought that was interesting. There's also, so it might be useful to do like the full, like just split up the sample if I'm understanding right, Emily, right? Between like, let's say gender or other types of demographic dimensions.
Yeah, and you have a small sample, so I would not necessarily encourage you to slice and dice this too many different ways. But for, I would have guessed the distance to the river might have made a difference. So it's interesting that it doesn't. And maybe that's just because it's a, relatively small area and you need greater variation in distance to really see some effects.
Yeah, I thought so too. I think part of the issue too is like, so we had, I think 3 subwards within each ward. So each subward is like 50 respondents. So it is a pretty small sample once we start dicing it. But hopefully with expanded data collection, I think, yeah, you would expect there to be a difference, right? And even between the 2 rivers, and you all probably know this way better than I do, but I think there's also some correlation with like who's settling by the rivers right? So like, especially around the East Rapti, from what I remember, there's a lot of Tharu communities, whereas that might not always be the case by like the Narayani River. So there might be like also demographic kind of
I can't
issues going
stop
there.
thinking about hauling the water uphill, which, dear guy Grant, much bigger issue in the mountains than in Chitwan. But nevertheless, the Rapti banks are, I mean, the banks of the rivers can get really high also, right? I mean, that is the distance between where your house is and where you have to go to get that water out of the river. That uphill might be an issue, even if your house is in the closer end of the spectrum. I don't know. Or at least you'd be aware of the change.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember right, I think a lot of the irrigation canals are more on the Narayani side, right? And not on the Rapti side.
Yep.
Yeah, that's another good point.
Well, the great news about it being complicated stuff is there's plenty more work to do.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
3 o'clock.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Nick.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for all your feedback and comments, and again for the support of doing this work, and hopefully see many of you at PAA next week. We can chat
Yep.
more.